1 week on, France remembers the 130 people killed in the worst terrorist attack in the country's history. Hello, I'm Imran Garta. Welcome to TRT World special coverage of the Paris attacks. Our teams in France join us for this hour-long program.
Hello, I'm Matthew Moore at the Place de la République, where so many people have come to pay tribute to those who have died. As the state of emergency is extended, we look at how the attacks have changed the country.
And I'm Soraya Lenny in Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. This is where police raided a hideout and killed the suspected ringleader of Friday's attacks. But just how did Abdelhamid Aboud slip into the country despite being a wanted man?
And we'll look at how the attacks may change the course of the war in Syria as world powers move closer together in their fight against Daesh. It was a week ago, an ordinary night out in the French capital, Paris. But the effects of what happened last Friday will now be felt not just in France, but globally. In this special program on TRT World, we'll look at how the world reacted to the shootings and bombings, how those attacks are expected to change the response by the international community, and what this may mean for refugees escaping from the war in Syria. Let's begin our special coverage in Paris with Matthew Moore, who's been following the story all week. He's in Place de la République. Matt?
Imran, a week ago today, at least 8 heavily armed men attacked this city on an unprecedented scale. They targeted people watching a football match, listening to music, and just celebrating the end of a working week by going to restaurants. We now know at least 130 people have been killed, and here is how the terror and subsequent manhunt unfolded.
3 coordinated teams, 6 attacks, beginning within 40 minutes of each other. It started at 9:20 in the evening. 3 men detonated their suicide vests outside the Stade de France, where France was playing Germany in a football friendly watched by President François Hollande. In central Paris, gunmen opened fire on people at several restaurants. And nearby at the Bataclan concert hall, 3 attackers fired their assault rifles relentlessly at fans watching a band.
We were by the bar, so we heard firecrackers, or what we thought were firecrackers. We turned around and then I saw 2 young men, older than 25, with Kalashnikovs. They told us to lie down. There was one who kept gesturing for us to get down. We all lay down. The whole room lay down. I was completely under other people, and they, the attackers, kept shooting, but they would stop from time to time.
Special forces went in within an hour. 2 attackers blew themselves up, another was shot. 7 assailants died during the attacks, but at least one, Salah Abdeslam, escaped. France's president declared a state of emergency and tightened the country's borders. François Hollande described the attacks as an act of war and pledged to wage a merciless campaign against Daesh, which claimed responsibility.
Mes chers compatriotes,
fellow citizens, what happened yesterday in Paris and Saint-Denis, near the Stade de France, was an act of war. Faced with war, the country has to take appropriate steps. It's an act of war committed by a terrorist army, Daesh, an Islamist army, against France, against the values we uphold throughout the world.
The people of France were in shock.
I keep asking myself why this happened. Something so senseless. They ended people's lives, young people, just senselessly. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts.
Authorities blamed French and Belgian nationals, identifying Abdeslam Aboud as the ringleader. Police and security forces started to carry out hundreds of raids and arrested dozens of militants, while seizing weapons that included a rocket launcher and assault rifles. At least 115,000 police and army personnel were mobilized to provide extra security around the country. As the investigations continued, Paris came to a standstill on Monday for a minute's silence at landmarks and the sites of the attacks. And then on Wednesday, a breakthrough. Police carried out a massive operation in Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. Abaoud, the ringleader, was their target. Heavily armed officers engaged in an intense firefight with the people inside. A woman detonated her suicide vest. Police and special forces fired around 5,000 rounds of ammunition.
I was woken up by a deafening noise, gunshots. It woke me up. I jumped out of bed. I opened the window. I stuck my head outside. There was smoke everywhere with helicopters. And afterwards, we found out that it was terrorists who were surrounded by police.
8 people were arrested and at least 3 were killed in the operation. One of them was Abaoud, who had somehow returned from fighting with Daesh in Syria without being noticed. The woman suicide bomber was his cousin and part of a cell that French authorities say was preparing further attacks.
An explosion rang out indicating the act of a suicide bomber. A body riddled with impacts was found in the ruins of the building. The first element of the investigation and the intervention of the police led us to believe that the explosion was the result of a woman who activated her explosive vest.
The suspected ringleader is now dead, but at least one attacker, Salah Abdeslam, is still at large, while the French have yet to come to terms with what happened.
Now we need to know how to bounce back and not dwell on it. We can't live anymore if we let events like this stop us. Afterwards, we have to let the police intervene and regulate the problems. But we also have to make sure not to dwell on it.
France's Congress has now extended the state of emergency for another 3 months, and changes to the constitution are being put forward. The French refuse to live in fear, but this attack has changed the country.
Well, we spoke to a man who was in the Bataclan concert hall at the time of the attacks. He managed to hide and was one of the last people to come out of the concert hall. Here's his story in his own words.
The band was playing for like 40 minutes when it started. It started like crackers blowing, and we thought it was part of the show. And we just, jumped behind the seats and start to crawl to an emergency exit. We end up hiding in between the ceiling and the roof because we've been stuck in some closet, and we break through the ceiling. We've been stuck there till the end, 1:30 in the morning. We kept in touch with the text. We've been able to text our families and friends who told us that the SWAT team was surrounding the building and they were about to get in. We were holding hands all together. At one moment, we sang together an AC/DC tune. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. That's a true story. We heard a big explosion and we knew that was the end. We entered the hall and they told us that this is very sensitive. If you don't want to see, don't see. We invite you to look down. But I had in my vision, I had bodies, and I looked up in the pit and I saw a huge pile of bodies. That was horrible. That was total mayhem.
The suspected ringleader and at least 7 of the attackers are dead. At least one is on the run. But who are these men and what is their background? Andrew Hopkins takes a look at the main suspects.
This is Abdelhamid Abaoud, the man identified as the ringleader of the Paris attacks. He was killed in a police raid north of the city on Wednesday, but he had already been linked to 4 other attacks on French soil this year that had been prevented. And though he's dead, there are still many questions.
We've had confirmation that Abdelhamid Abaoud was under the rubble, but we need to know why this man, who was the subject of an international arrest warrant issued by Belgium, was able to cross a series of borders.
There were 3 main locations where the attackers struck. 3 blew themselves up outside the Stade de France, the national stadium. 3 were also involved in the attack at the Bataclan concert hall. 2 detonated their suicide vests, and another shot dead by police. One attacker blew himself up in Boulevard Voltaire after a series of shootings targeting restaurants and bars. Some of them seem to have evaded the authorities. At least 8 other people in addition to Abaoud were involved in the attacks. The 3 at the Stade de France included Ahmed al-Mohammed. He's known to have travelled through Greece, Serbia and Croatia on the route used by refugees. But police suspect he used a forged Syrian passport. Another was Bilal Hadfi. He was a French national living in Belgium who's known to have visited Syria this year. The 3 involved at the Bataclan concert hall included Ismail Omar Mostafai. He'd been on a French watch list for 5 years, and the Turkish government had warned Paris about him twice in the past 12 months. Another was Sami Amimour. He was a former bus driver who had been under investigation for 2 years because of his plan to go to Yemen. And it doesn't end there. Ibrahim Abdesalam blew himself up at a cafe in Boulevard Voltaire, but his brother Salah is still on the run. He was sent back to Belgium where he'd been living after trying to enter Syria from Turkey, but was then released. The French Interior Minister has warned there needs to be better coordination.
It's important that Europe wakes up, pulls itself together and takes part in the defence against terrorism.
In the immediate aftermath, raids were carried out in at least 7 areas of France. But since then, those operations have increased in number and have also now involved Belgium. But the biggest development so far has been the raid in Saint-Denis, north of Paris. That resulted in the death of Abaoud and his cousin, who the French prosecutor says blew herself up. An indication that this investigation is far from over. Andrew Hopkins, TRT World.
Now, in addition to extending the state of emergency, President Hollande wants to see changes to the constitution. He wants more powers to fight Daesh and other extreme groups.
The constitution is the collective pact indispensable for living together, and it is legitimate that the constitution includes a way of fighting against those people who wish to violate it. In the same way, associations or groups of people who provoke hatred or incite terrorist attacks must inevitably be destroyed.
Well, let's bring in Miriam Francois-Gérard now. She's a TRT World contributor and a Middle East specialist. Let's start with what the President is asking for, Miriam. He wants to have emergency powers in his back pocket without actually declaring a state of emergency. What are people making of that?
Certainly that's what his critics are saying. So the state of emergency law extension passed here with near unanimity in the French Parliament. Just 6 people opposed it, 1 abstention, and there's wide public support for it. 84% of the French supported the extension. Now the real question is, this is viewed as a prelude to possible changes to the constitution being proposed by Hollande, and this is where some of the concerns are being voiced a little bit more loudly. Certainly when it comes to one proposed amendment that's passed with regards to the state of emergency law, and that comes to the government's right to block certain websites. Critics are saying this is a form of censorship, and they're very concerned about whether this would be a permanent measure.
So we're seeing France here potentially changing in the future. After all, it's calling itself the home to human rights, etc. You're a Middle East specialist and you know quite a bit about Daesh. How would they be viewing these changes in France right now?
Well, interestingly, one of the senators who abstained from voting in favour of the state of emergency law extension said if this was an attack on our freedoms, we might as well be handing a victory to Daesh. And so evidently her concerns are that if this was effectively an attempt to change the very nature of France, then that's certainly what the government seems to be doing. But more to the point, another concern she raised was about the possibility that these moments of political unity can turn on the minorities in our midst. And she says that actually when that happens, you're also handing a victory to Daesh, because their objective is to divide societies in the West.
We're going to come back to what's happening with the minority Muslim population in a moment. But first, let me ask you about what the Prime Minister Manuel Valls said earlier in the week. He said they didn't attack us because of what we're doing in Iraq and in Syria. They attacked us because of who we are. What do you make of that?
Certainly that's been a leitmotif of a lot of the commentary that we've heard, this idea that there's a clash of civilizations, that this is an ideological movement that's really just motivated by a hatred for, its branding of Paris as the capital of abomination and perversion. Certainly there is an ideological component to Daesh, but their propaganda material that has come out after the attacks has been quite clear in the motivations, and they point to France's involvement in the bombing of territories currently under Daesh control.
Okay, Miriam, thank you very much for now. We'll come back to you a little later. Let's concentrate on what's happening with the Muslim population now. And we're going to go to Saint-Denis. You may remember that's where the ringleader was found, that huge operation on Wednesday, and where he was killed. Soraya Lenny is there for us. Soraya.
Well, France's Muslim and immigrant communities have come under intense scrutiny since the attacks. Of course, first, because of the attacks. Second, because Abdelhamid Aboud, the supposed ringleader, was found hiding out here in what is a very diverse suburb. Now, I've spent the week talking to Muslims across Paris about what the attacks mean and also what that means for them, being French and Muslim. They say that Daesh not only attacked the French Republic, but also Islam. This is the oldest mosque in France, built in 1926 to honour the Muslim contribution to the Allies' World War I victory. But these days, some men and women head to prayers not just with faith, but with questions like what it means to be French and Muslim. Jafar is 28, secular and studies philosophy, but does not feel welcome in his own country, especially after Friday's terrorist attacks in Paris.
We're being murdered 3 times, first as men, second as Frenchmen, third as Muslims. These attacks have been very difficult, maybe more so for us than other citizens.
It's estimated 6 million French citizens are Muslim, out of a total population of some 66 million. A recent study shows discrimination against them is rife. It revealed a Muslim Frenchman has to send 4 times as many applications than a non-Muslim counterpart to even get a job interview. These men back up that point.
At the beginning, there's a big problem. The life of an Arab or Muslim in France isn't ideal. It's so complicated getting a job, even an apartment.
Many fear France is losing a whole generation of youth. The rector of the Grand Mosque says parents need to shoulder the responsibility more.
They have not the parents who lead them, who force them to go to school, and the schools they have are not good schools to receive them.
Some French Muslims say a bigger issue than discrimination and unemployment exists here. They say they have very little political representation, and that means the country's leaders don't hear their concerns. Still, 5 days after the Paris attacks, potential presidential candidate Alain Juppé came to visit. But such appearances don't impress many here.
The elite are supposed to represent us, but we don't recognize ourselves in them.
And the challenge for France in a time of tension is recognizing this problem has 2 sides. Well, only 2 million people in France consider themselves practicing Muslims. That means the rest are secular, and many have been here for generations. They've come from the former French colonies of Algeria, of Morocco, and Tunisia. First and foremost, they consider themselves French and very much part of the multicultural tapestry that France exalts. Imran?
Thanks for that, Soraya. We will no doubt come back to you a little bit later on. Now, the attack was carried out in Paris, but the people responsible for it had strong ties to the Belgian capital, Brussels. The ringleader, Abdelhamid Aboud, lived there, as did the Abdesalam brothers. Our correspondent, Hannah Hoxter, has been to Brussels and has the latest for us. Hannah?
Yes, I spent a lot of time in Molenbeek, which is the town where they all lived. And I actually spoke to many people who knew the brothers, and one of them said he was very close to Salah. And he said that from his understanding, he was a very nice, well-adjusted person, so he can't work out how he would have changed his character so dramatically to take part, be one of the alleged governments, but of course we don't know yet. But many of the people who we spoke to were in shock, and they couldn't believe that this had brought back the world's attention on that district in the Belgian capital, Brussels. So this is our report. As soon as investigations into the terrorist attack started, the search narrowed in on a borough in the Belgian capital. Raid police zeroed in on Molenbeek, detaining alleged accomplices and discovering more clues about the attackers. Molenbeek was the home of at least 3 people involved in the attacks. These are the streets they walked in. This was the bar they owned. This is still the Abdel Salam's family home, overlooking the main square. Molenbeek has been described as Little Morocco, but it's also been in the spotlight. In the past 2 years, it's been linked to 4 different terrorist attacks, and authorities here in Belgium know they need to do something to combat that. This nondescript suburb of one of Europe's main cities does not look ripe for homebred fundamentalism, but appearances can be deceptive. And Molenbeek's deputy mayor is especially worried.
Molenbeek has seen more than 30 local youths go off to Syria. That's huge given the size of this community.
But he warns it's not unique to Molenbeek. This is a global problem.
We are struggling to contain a sect, the Frankenstein of terror. They have the capacity to hit anywhere. They're using tools we cannot hope to counter, like social media and appealing videos.
This area's population is 80% Muslim, with 40 mosques in 1 square kilometre. Local residents say the very high unemployment makes the young vulnerable to being radicalised. Molenbeek is uncomfortable with this depiction of their town. During a vigil held on Wednesday to remember the victims of the attacks, locals respond angrily to the backlash against their community.
We are here to say we are not terrorists. We are in Molenbeek, we are living in peace.
Religion is not terrorism, and it's so sorry to think that Muslims are terrorists. It's not the reality.
The Belgian government says its heightened security levels means from now on there will be more police presence. Another danger of increased security presence is the continued marginalisation of Molenbeek's community. Hannah Hoxter, TRT World, Molenbeek.
Hannah, after the Paris attacks, the French response is well documented. The state of emergency, the bombings in Raqqa. Belgium undoubtedly going through a lot of introspection as well. Per capita, Belgium contributes more ISIS fighters than anybody else. A shameful record, I'd imagine. On the political level, what sort of changes have there been in the past week, and what sort of changes can we foresee?
Well, the politicians have reacted. First of all, they've reacted and said, well, actually, we've got very good intelligence, and we have provided that intelligence to the French government, and that is a result of many of the arrests that have been made. We had the Interior Minister who spoke out as soon as it emerged that many of the links did come from Molenbeek, and said that we know this place is an issue and we vow to tidy it up. Meanwhile, the opposition have said, well, we've been complaining to you for months. You need to invest, you need to sort of target the mosques and also target the social media, which is deliberately going to try and radicalise people. We've also had the Prime Minister, Charles Michel, who said that he's prepared to put a state of emergency law in place there as well, so that they can act and arrest anyone they feel is suspicious. They've also added extra troops, extra security forces, and there's much tougher security measures in place, certainly from what we saw when we were there.
Live from Paris, Hannah Hoxter, thanks so much for that for now. Well, one of the attacks took place at the national stadium, the Stade de France, while the French played in a football-friendly match against Germany. It's created a renewed sense of urgency for the security of players and fans at major sporting events. With France due to host the European Football Championships next summer, Lance Santos reports on whether the events will actually go ahead.
After an emotional night at Wembley, France's football fans and governing body have begun looking forward to Euro 2016, which will take place in the country of the summer of next year. But the big question after Friday's terror attacks is, will the tournament be safe?
Everywhere you go in Paris, there are constant reminders of the sheer terror that devastated this city. The names, the faces, and the touching tributes are a very poignant reminder of the mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters who are now no longer with us. Although life will never be the same, Parisians are trying to fight back by returning to normality. The European Championships will go ahead despite the obvious threats, and in June, France will host one of sport's major events. But in doing so, there is the added threat of a repeat attack.
Without a doubt, they will be looking at it. As we said, when they look at their selection of targets, the mass casualty, the crowded places that are soft, are high on their agenda. What they did at Charlie Hebdo, you look at what they've done recently in Paris, it'll be high on their agenda to say, you know, we've hit you once, we've hit you twice, we can do it a third time.
On Friday night, this street was filled with thousands of football fans, but amongst them, 3 suicide bombers. One of the attackers came up this path and stood right here at Gate C. His intention, to make it inside and murder thousands. But security stopped the man and searched him. And in the panic that ensued, he ran across the road.
Moments later, the suicide bomber blew himself up outside this bar, killing one other person. Hundreds of thousands of fans from across Europe are expected to travel to France for the month-long competition. And with the championship spread across 10 cities, security measures are already topping the agenda.
Everybody has been scared over this last weekend. I mean, all Parisian people, we have felt terrorized, scared, everybody. We have to ensure fan zones, the zones where we can have thousands of people watching games and going to businesses, drinks, or shops. They are secured, they are closed.
The French government and UEFA insist that cancelling the event would play into the hands of the terrorists.
Violence will not stop us carrying on in our own way, the way we decide to live our lives. So I don't think there is any chance of the Euros being moved somewhere else, and I don't think anybody seriously wants this to happen.
Sport alone cannot erase the memories of Friday the 13th. But as this country is showing, it has the power to unite the nation even in the face of such adversity.
Still to come on this special program, we'll look at the international reaction to the events in France and what it may mean for the war in Syria. Welcome back to our special program to mark 1 week since the attacks in Paris. More fighters head to fight in Syria from France than from any other European country. So what is it about life there that persuades people that joining the fight is a better option than remaining? Let's return now to Soraya Lenny, who's in the Saint-Denis area north of Paris. Soraya?
Thank you, Imran. Now, the global policing agency Interpol says it has about 6,000 names on its foreign terrorist fighters database. Now, that information's been provided by 50 countries, including France. Now, many of the French citizens are actually fighting for Daesh in Syria and in Iraq. And that's raised a lot of questions back here at home, including how and why so many young French men and women have become radicalized. It's with a heavy heart Thierry faces the day. His son, 23-year-old Felix, is gone. And that's left this man and his family broken-hearted.
All his childhood was happy. He loved sports. We were a very close family. We never fought. We shared many things in common.
Felix was born and raised here in Paris, but now he's fighting with Daesh in Syria. Just one of an estimated 1,200 French citizens who've joined the group there and in Iraq.
For the state of France, my son is a terrorist, but to me, he's not. He's a victim of this situation. His radicalization did not happen in Syria, it happened in France. Hence, it is in France we have to fight this radicalization. And until politicians understand this obvious thing, there won't be a solution.
The government has acknowledged there is a problem. It's launched a campaign to stop the stream of French citizens joining Daesh. And Thierry is part of it. But some say Friday's terrorist attacks show this is not working, that France has deeper problems. It's what the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls calls apartheid, the gap between society and disenfranchised youth. Yasser Louati is with France's leading group battling Islamophobia. He points to what he says is the root cause.
When you have people being cast aside from society from an early age, our schools in France and then places of work are places of massive discrimination. So at the same time, we can't have these kids believing that they belong to this country and then not be tempted when they are weak enough to be used by these terrorist groups. And unfortunately, these groups have been clever enough, just like Satan, into using our social problems to turn them against us.
The French government says it has an estimated 3,000 citizens which have been radicalised and are under scrutiny of the intelligence services. And more of its citizens are fighting in Syria than that of any other European country. This man knows that well. He's seen it firsthand. Nicolas Hénin is a French journalist who spent 10 months as a hostage of Daesh in Raqqa.
I remember once a young jihadi from Western Europe told us, well, that's a surprise for you to see us here. But don't be surprised, because for us it's a bit like the Spanish Civil War. We have seen our brothers being massacred and the world doing nothing. So we decided to get involved and to come and join the fight.
But here, families of some victims of Friday's attack are mourning. But so too were those parents who tried to hold on to their children, but could not. And one of the biggest challenges Europe faces is actually cutting off access from the recruiters. They're not always on the ground, in the streets, in the suburbs here in Europe. Police say, in fact, the vast majority are on the internet, and that's where they're preying on vulnerable youth. But realistically, police say that's exactly the place where there are no borders they can police. Imran, back to you.
Now, in the week since the attacks in Paris, we've already seen airstrikes against Daesh stepped up by both France and Russia. At the recent G20 economic summit in Antalya, Turkey, world leaders pledged to take military action to counter the threat posed by the terror group. Nick Davies-Jones reports.
Words are measured by actions.
France is already a strong counterterrorism partner, and today we're announcing a new agreement. We're streamlining the process by which we share intelligence.
Following the terror attacks in Paris by gunmen affiliated to Daesh, the coalition fighting them has been backing its words with bombs. Lots of them. Russia's leader Vladimir Putin has also acted decisively. The ex-KGB leader responded to the downing of a Russian airliner over Egypt by Daesh with 230 bombing raids in 2 days. He's even offered an olive branch to opposition groups.
If this part of the armed opposition finds it possible to start actively fighting terrorist groups, first of all IS, they have our air support, and we are prepared to provide it.
There have even been suggestions that the US and Russian military have been in cooperation with each other, but the US military has denied this. But Daesh hides among people, and the array of bombs also cause suffering to civilians. Syrian monitoring groups suggest Russia's air campaign may have killed as many as 1,300 people since it began a little more than 2 months ago. Only 2/3 of those killed are believed to have been combatants, and those figures are certain to rise when France's largest aircraft carrier arrives in the Persian Gulf in the coming hours, to further intensify the offensive against Daesh.
Let's speak now to Richard Murphy. He's former US ambassador to Syria. He joins us from New York. Ambassador Murphy, thanks a lot for joining us. Is bombing ISIS in Raqqa the answer?
No, it's not. It's unfortunate, but airstrikes are very useful to Daesh. It's a good recruiting for them. Look, the world is gathering. All these major powers are conspiring, as they always have, against Islam, and we are the sole defender of Islam. And the airstrikes are not going to do it.
Now, many feel that Syria is at the genesis of all of this and that a political solution to the conflict in Syria might help get rid of Daesh and, of course, stop the general bloodshed. But is that really possible, given that the Russians want a solution with Bashar al-Assad in power and the Americans and its allies want a solution with him leaving?
The differences between us, and the Russians and Iranians on one side, vis-a-vis the Assad regime, and our side, if you will, with the Saudis, the Qataris, and many of the Europeans, that gap has not been closed yet, and it's going to be the subject of very intense talks in the coming weeks. The last meeting in Vienna said that by the end of the year, there should be a list agreed upon for provisions for a ceasefire in the area, and a list of those that would participate in negotiations. That target is going to be very, very hard to reach.
The Saudis plan to, sorry to interrupt you, sir. The Saudis plan to unify the opposition in the coming weeks. They want to get the so-called moderate rebel groups together in terms of a unified front. Is that possible from Saudi Arabia, particularly being driven by Saudi Arabia, the country that beheads people for witchcraft and sorcery?
Well, it's a good question. There's an effort in Jordan as well as in the Saudis, to try to find a way to get these fractious opposition elements to cooperate. And that's a mission that the American government has been on for the last 3 years, and without marked success. The Saudis, the Qataris, have been, without question, responsible for funding, some of it government, much of it private funding, going to extremist groups within Syria. And that must stop if there's going to be a realistic prospect of a political negotiation.
Ambassador, I want to step back for a moment, step back in history, if you like, and ask you a very personal question. You were ambassador in 1982 when Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, essentially carpet-bombed an insurgency, killed thousands of people in Hama. How would you compare, admittedly, the United States did nothing and said nothing. How would you compare the situation now to when Hafiz al-Assad was bombing those he considered terrorists?
There's a fundamental change. The area is now following events within Syria, from Syria to looking at Egypt, Tunisia, Libya. There's much more awareness on the part of the people, the local people, as to what's going on. Hafiz al-Assad had a very strong control over the media in those first days after the shelling of Hama. It was field artillery shelling. And the Syrians themselves were not talking about it. When I came to visit, not as ambassador, but I was assistant secretary for the Middle East. It was not a subject that people cared to raise with you, and Hafiz al-Assad referred to it in my many conversations in the 80s, only once in passing.
That was fascinating, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Richard Murphy joining us from New York. Well, as the airstrikes are stepped up in Syria, more and more people try to escape the violence. Many cross the border into Turkey, where they remain in refugee camps. Let's speak now to Zaina Awad, who joins us now from Gaziantep in southern Turkey. Zaina?
Indeed, Imran, we are seeing it firsthand here. Syrians are continuing to cross the border. They're coming to refugee camps. They're coming to towns and cities such as Gaziantep. Earlier on Friday, we met with a family of 6 who have arrived here recently, earlier this week, and they came from Raqqa. They were escaping the airstrikes as well as Daesh control. Now, they came here illegally with smugglers with about 500 Syrians. They spent 4 days and 5 nights sleeping out in the open in the bitter cold. They were terrified. And when they finally got here, we managed to sit down and speak to the mother. Now, we have to have her identity in order to protect her. And we began by asking her why, after living under Daesh control for 2 years, did she and her family decide to finally leave Raqqa?
We left because of the airstrikes. We couldn't take it anymore. Airstrikes have intensified a lot over the last 2 to 3 months. An airstrike killed my 10-year-old cousin. The air pressure from the strike threw him against the wall. His head was split open and he died. You wonder, what has this child done to deserve this? Most of the casualties are civilians. A plane recently bombed a Daesh detention center. They took down 5 buildings around it. Each one of the buildings was destroyed and everyone inside was killed. When we spoke to our families last, they told us that Daesh has been taking the men. The young men of Raqqa, they have nothing to do with Daesh, but they are being forced to join them and forced to join their jihad. Perhaps Daesh is running out of fighters and they need to grow their ranks. A Daesh member usually comes first, then his family follows him, his wife and children. Some of them also marry local women from Raqqa. And they come from many countries: Russia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Tunisia. There are many countries. I can't keep count of all of them. Some of them come to fight and win and take over other areas. And some of the Daesh women work in morality enforcement. Their job is to flog the women who aren't abiding by Daesh's dress code.
A Syrian mother who just arrived here from Raqqa with her family, escaping Daesh control on the ground and airstrikes, American airstrikes, Russian, French airstrikes from the air. Now, the conditions are making life much more difficult and much more insecure for Syrians, impossible even, and that is why we're going to continue to see Syrians streaming over the border, escaping the war back home. And that's it from us here in Gaziantep. Imran, it's back to you in the studio.
Thanks so much for that, Zaina Awad, there in Gaziantep. Now let's go back to the topic of radicalization. Many of these attacks from Daesh in Paris and elsewhere carried out by young men and women who are ready to kill and die for Daesh. Let's try to understand it for a moment and speak to Michael Zakulan. He's a political science professor and security expert at the University of Calgary in Canada. Michael, a lot of focus on this suburb of Brussels called Molenbeek. From all the information that we have, there seems to be a lot of poverty, a lot of disenchanted youth, and sheikhs spreading a hardcore version of Salafi Islam. Is that it?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. You're talking about a myriad of factors that contribute. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that it's a very individualistic process. So what motivates one individual does not necessarily speak to another, although we do look at several things that we believe contribute in some way, which are some of the ones you mentioned. So a couple of things we talk about would be things such as alienation, isolation, relative deprivation, this idea that they are not as well off as others, and that may apply not as from an individual perspective, but in terms of looking at a larger group around them. And you couple this with the sort of social interaction amongst peers and friends, which serves as a multiplier in this case. And so the bottom line is that these things are not necessarily sufficient to cause somebody to become radicalized, but we are sort of recognizing that individuals who are alienated, who are looking for a sense of purpose, who are disillusioned, may often turn to look for new ideas, of which radical Islamists might be one.
A lot of people have different theories. On the one hand, people are saying it's mainly or fundamentally about the radical ideology. On the other hand, people are saying no, it's mainly political and social factors. Which one's closer to the truth? I know they both play a part, but which one is more of a factor?
Well, and there's a tremendous debate about this in the literature. So initially, following 9/11, as we moved forward, the idea was that sort of embedded within the ideas themselves was a propensity to violence. So, assuming the ideas meant that, you would easily or more easily go down a path where you would accept and pursue violence. Today, we're not so sure that's the case, and so what we look at is the realization that perhaps the decision to sort of adopt radical ideas is going to be completely separate from then choosing to sort of act violently based upon them. And so this is sort of something you look at, and we recognize that there are lots of individuals with radical ideas that never sort of turn to violence, just as we notice that there are some of these individuals who are incredibly violent who don't necessarily subscribe to the religious context at all. So it's really difficult to sort out, and one of the problems is it's very difficult to sort of sort out empirically or methodologically and try to test test these things and come up with answers.
Now, how do the Belgians and the French and all these other countries, governments, police departments, community leaders, how do they try to de-radicalize those likely to cause harm and join Daesh?
Well, and that's a further debate that's sort of unfolding in the literature as well right now, is whether de-radicalization is actually sort of the way to go in terms of actually trying to change people's ideas. The discussion now is focusing on disengagement. It's sort of recognizing that people can disagree, that people can share or have certain ideas, but as long as they find sort of alternative outlets for them, be it sort of in a political spectrum or an ability to sort of gather and voice your concerns or your grievances, that it offers an outlet which may prevent individuals from choosing a violent path. And again, you sort of hit the nail on the head here. This is going to require multiple stakeholders at all levels of government, the community, religious leaders. And what we have to do is we have to challenge the various facets of what ISIS is sort of espousing. So there's a religious context to it. There's an ethical and a moral context to it. And quite frankly, there's a lifestyle context to it in terms of telling individuals exactly what they're in for should they choose to travel and join this group.
Michael Zagulan, great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. Now, the number of refugees coming from Syria still shows no sign of slowing down. But as the numbers rise, so too does opposition from the political right in Europe. Well, in response, EU ministers in Brussels have agreed to tighten controls at the bloc's external borders. It's part of a list of new security measures that includes a registry for airline passenger names and increased restrictions on guns. France also says the EU is going to propose major changes to the area known as the Schengen zone by the end of this year.
The strengthening of controls at external borders is indispensable for the protection of European citizens, especially in the light of recent terrorist attack. We have been saying this for months now, which is why the Commission has agreed to tabling a draft reform of the Schengen Code by the end of year, to allow us for systematic and obligatory checks to be carried out at all our external borders and on all people entering the Schengen zone, including those who benefit from the freedom of movement. This is absolutely crucial.
Now, the attacks in France were not isolated events. Acts of terror and violence are all too common. But the way the world responds to them often differs dramatically. Let's speak now to our reporter Fidelis Mba. Fidelis, contextualize Mali for us and why people around the world should care more.
Well, most of the people, who are actually disturbing Mali, some of the militants who have carried out these attacks, are splinter groups of Al-Qaeda. And these people, France has been carrying out extensive military operations against them for many years now. And now targeting a luxury hotel, which before now many people had thought was impossible, because before now they were restricted to northern Mali, and now they're coming down south. They've crossed the central. So this would be sort of a worry for many people, not just for France, because France is, people are saying, why didn't the same thing, like you said, the Paris attack, the whole world is looking at it. Why should they bother about Mali? Anything that affects Mali affects the entire Sahel region, and even, trickles down up to the point where Boko Haram is controlling around Cameroon, Nigeria, Chad, and Niger.
Okay, Fidelis, thanks a lot for that update. Let's speak now to Besma Momani. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and joins us from Halifax in Canada. Thanks for joining us, Besma. Do you believe there's a double standard in terms of selective empathy?
It's natural. I think that we tend to emphasize our own. And so I would suspect that in Beirut, in the Middle East, there's a great deal of emphasis on what happened in Lebanon as an important part of the regional context. And similarly in Africa, there's going to be a greater emphasis on Mali. That said, of course, I think in terms of what is elevated on the international political scale, undoubtedly there is a bias and there is a bit of hypocrisy there, that some powerful countries' citizens matter more than some of the more or less developed countries. I think that's a real shame.
Okay, and we've seen Nigeria, we've seen Beirut, we've seen Mali now. Many are responding and almost using what has been termed whataboutery. On the other end of the spectrum, is it disingenuous for every time there's an attack for somebody to say, but what about the attack elsewhere?
No, I don't think so. I think that if we're going to mourn human lives, we need to be as sympathetic as possible to the reality that terrorism is touching everywhere. I mean, too often, and I think that many in the Muslim community, for example, will point out, Islamic State kills far more Muslims than non-Muslims. I mean, it's really brutal, not only in Syria, but abroad. And so that's important. I think that if you don't know the facts, you do start to, I think, come up with these distorted arguments that we see too often on the right wing of the media. But, at the end of the day, those who want to mourn innocent civilians' lives, I think, are being genuine by saying, look, life is a life. Doesn't matter if it's black, white, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Jew, it's all the same. And I think that's a really important point.
So how do we raise our collective empathy and get people plugged into caring more about all these issues in multiple countries? Because it is hard for people to keep up, isn't it?
It sure is. It absolutely is. And I think as a Middle East specialist, I often say I miss what's happening in East Asia. I miss what's happening in Latin America. It's not to say that one is cruel. It's just a reality of there's an inundated amount of news. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that through globalization, information communication technology, we are inundated with a lot of news about everything. And we are being forced to think about all these great human tragedies, whether they're natural disasters or war or terrorism. And so it's understandable, I think, that we're being torn that way. But I think it's also our responsibility, if you're going to be one that speaks up for civilians that are being killed, that you really emphasize that regardless of where it takes place.
Besma Momani, thank you very much for joining us. Let's end this special program in Paris and we return to my colleague Matthew Moore. Matt?
Imran, most of the people who were killed last week were young. They were in their 20s. They came from 19 different countries. And tonight, France and the world remembers them. We leave you with some of their images.